This is the Conscious Radio Network.
This is February 8th, 2015.
And I'm Justin Wassel, your co-host.
And we bring to you this evening, we have a special guest, Reverend Ben Cox from the Chapel of Spiritual Light in Orlando, Florida.
Reverend Ben is a spiritualist minister. Go ahead, Reverend Ben, and tell us more about your work, and we're going to jump right in tonight.
I'm a spiritualist minister, a medium, a healer, a teacher, and a lecturer. Spiritualism is my life. It is a way of life. It's the way I live. It's interesting because I live between two worlds. I am a communicator between this dimension and the next one. So you never know what's going to happen. Life is interesting.
And you have been the pastor of the Chapel of Spiritual Light for how long?
Almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years.
Been attending for almost 3, but...
Now, according to your bio, you kind of got all into this, was it 87, 89, when you went to Cassadaga?
Late 87, early 88, somewhere in there, my ex and I decided we were going to Cassadaga to have a reading. It was a lark. It was fun, you know, and I got there and I realized after I'd been there about 10 minutes that I had found myself and I'd found my home and I'd found who I was. And it's just been a total way of life since then. Yeah, we went back to Groveland and told people where we'd gone, and this was the 80s, and people were shocked. And we were told that we were terrible, bad people for going over to Cassadaga, and that we had to follow the true faith, except that we had found our true faith. We had found our truth, and it worked for us. Mm-hmm. And I've never looked back.
Yeah. And for those listeners out there that don't know who or what Cassadaga is a spiritualist camp just outside of Orange City, Daytona Beach, DeLand, in that area of the, I guess that would be considered still the Central Florida, northern Central Florida area.
It's the mother church of the South.
Reverend Ben, could you talk a little bit about Cassadaga, and at least as far as how people are usually drawn there, how you were drawn there, and what that experience is a bit like, and then how you see that experience as you experienced it initially?
When I went to Cassadaga the first time, of course, I was a weird guy to start with. I was aware of about 6 past existences, which means I'm a reincarnationist. And I got to Cassadaga and I realized, oh my gosh, these people believe in reincarnation. I fit in. You know, I'm not weird over here. Okay. And I really, really enjoyed it. Then I went to the first church service that I'd ever been to in a spiritualist church. And we read the principles of guidance. And the first one said, we believe in infinite intelligence. It wasn't this personal God. It was this energy, this force that permeates all of us and all of everything. And the conceptions were so very much like what I had arrived at on my own. I didn't have any trouble accepting things. Yes, coming out of a Methodist Lutheran background, I had to do some tweaking when it came to Jesus. But to realize that Jesus is the greatest spiritualist, healer, teacher, prophet who ever lived, and then you start reading the scriptures in that light, and you look at what he does, and you look at what he says, and you realize how he fits right into spiritualism. I mean, I could make a case that spiritualism is a Christian religion, and I could make a case that Christianity is a spiritual religion, that there's really not a whole lot of difference.
Well, let's go into that a little bit, because, you know, this is interesting to look at what is written of in the Bible about particular accounts and occurrences.
Especially when it comes to mediumship.
Right.
Mediumship within the scriptures.
Well, every time you hear about an angelic visitor, like the angel came to Joseph and said, or the angel came to whoever and said, those are spirit messengers. We get spirit messengers today. And the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus, the greatest spiritualist in the world, brings through Elijah and Moses, clothes them in ectoplasm, walks and talks with them. Our mediums do the same things today. Jesus is the greatest example of what we do and who we are. And I could go on and on and on and pick out examples through the Torah and the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah.
You know, we could just talk about the Bible and be here all night, you know.
And there's an interesting book that has to do with the Bible and also with spiritualism.
It's called the Encyclopedia of Biblical Spiritualism by Moses Hull.
Right.
And I used that as the basis for a paper in my master's program called Wrapped in Spirit. And my prof looked at it and he said, somebody's already done your homework. Well, yeah. There's some conceptions. Moses Hull says that the God of the Old Testament is a different God to the God of the New Testament. He also says that the God of the Old Testament is an ancient Egyptian pharaoh whose spirit went up to live in the hills when he died. And the old conception of the Hebrew God, which was El, E-L, is a hill god, which became a war god. So you got all those conceptions wandering around.
This is something interesting. The first time I've heard the word El, or if you're familiar with Zecharia, Sitchin, and
Yes.
the Chariots of the Gods, in the book of Chariots of the Gods, they mention El in Zecharia Sitchin's work, The 12th Planet, as well as in Eric Van Daniken's book, Chariots of the God, which is kind of...
Zecharia Sitchin is on to something that's important.
Yeah.
I've read all his books. I need to read them again because he's dealing factually and he's on to something very, very important. Mm-hmm. I have seen photographs of the human genome where the alien DNA was spliced into it. And if you don't believe that, I have seen the pictures. We are at least partially star stuff. We come from out there because the aliens came in. That sounds really wild, doesn't it? The aliens came in. But the aliens came in and took what was basically a very animalistic kind of creation and improved it. And you go through all the legends in the Aztecs and the Incas about how these gods came down from the skies and taught them how to farm and taught them how to make cloth and taught them how to do all these things. I mean, you got to look at some of that stuff. Some of that stuff makes way too much sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's also like these days, the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution, and then the space age, and how fast technology has just gone toward.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, you know, of course, nanotechnology, and then crazy, really ways that we could never conceive of.
And even Nikola Tesla even claimed and even wrote in some of his private memoirs that the information he got, he channeled from the stars, from the cosmos.
And I'm not sure that Atlantis didn't happen. And I'm not sure that we are as advanced yet as Atlantis was when it sank. And I think it sank because they misused the energies they had. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, there's a whole lot of things I wonder about. And if I started telling people everything I wondered about and everything I questioned, you know, they would probably run hide somewhere.
Now, as far as your own experience and what you generally are up to, right? Could you talk a little bit about that as far as in your journey, the most poignant, say, duties and tasks that you've been called to do in your life?
Well, I was certified as a medium in 1996, which means that from 1991 to 1996, I was studying and practicing, just like my students do in class. We give messages, you give short readings. And I ended up in front of the board members. The board members came to my table, and I was shaking in my boots. But the evidence I gave them, apparently, was satisfactory. In fact, Reverend Janie Owens, who is the pastor at Cassadaga now, still tells me that I knew something about her that she didn't even know was coming. And it happened exactly the way I said it would, and it's changed her whole life. So things like that happen. And then in 2002, of course, the reason there's a big gap of 6 years between my mediumship and my ministry certification is because I was the organist at Cassadaga. And I got off track. I was in the ministerial program, but I was doing readings, and I was playing the organ, and I was singing. I was having a good time. And all of a sudden, about 2000, Spirit said, "Hey, Dodo," "Hey," knocked on my head and said, "You want to be a minister?" And I said, "Yeah." "Well, let's get on with it." I said, "Okay." And I got really going in the program. About 2002, I was ordained. And I'm still working in the church, and I'm playing the organ, and I'm singing, and I'm doing all this stuff, doing readings, and I'm doing healing in the back of the church, and I'm doing healing in other places. I've done healing all over this country. I've done healing in Canada, done healing in Europe, and so much of that healing was evidential, and people would give me letters. I submitted a folder of letters to the board at Cassadaga in 2008 and was certified as a healer. So ever since then, I function in those three ways. I reached a point in 2010, I was asked to be pastor at Cassadaga, which is an honor like, wow, because that's the huge mother church of the South. And I was pastor during 2010, 2011. Also got involved on the board, got involved in the political structures. And my guides, in particular Ome, who is a guide from a whole nother dimension. He's never been in it's never been in a body. Ome told me that I needed to leave Cassadaga because I couldn't grow there anymore. And I politely ignored him, her, it. And soon after that, things started happening in my life that made it impossible for me to get to Cassadaga. And Ome would come through and say, "No, what else do I need to do?" And so finally, I let go of my membership there. And then my whole life straightened back up. I started attending the Chapel of Spiritual Light. And I was independent. Reverend Rick Smith, my partner, myself, we were traveling and we were doing mediumship and we were doing seances and we were having a grand time. We travel between Fort Lauderdale and Jacksonville. Have a wonderful time. And we work for Spirit. And all of a sudden, we're working, and the church at the Chapel of Spiritual Light says, "Gregory's leaving, Reverend Gregory Kent. Would you be our pastor?" And I said, "Okay." And so I took over. It's been just about a year and a half, a little more. It'll be 2 years this June. And I love this little church. They are the most amazing group of people. And they're fun and they're loving. The board meetings, we have fun. We have 4 psychic festivals a year, which we organize. We just have a good time serving Spirit. Yeah. And this church has gotten used to the fact that I'm going to lead them out of the box. Mm-hmm. We are not traditional spiritualists. Because to me, spiritualism is everything, and everything is spiritualism. I don't care what label you call it, if you call it Buddhism or Celtic paganism. I don't care what you call it. It's still spiritualism in some form.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I bet you that there are a lot of folks out there who might not be familiar with spiritualism, and they're hearing those statements right there saying that, it's all of the above, and it isn't any of the above, just the same distinctly. And so could you talk a little bit about that?
Especially people out there who don't know exactly, they'll hear the word spiritualism, but they're like, well, define that a little bit more. What exactly is spiritualism?
I'm going to do that 2 ways. I'm going to define it, and make sure I come back to this. I'm going to define it as a religion, a philosophy, and a science. But I want to come back to that. I want to tell you something that a medium told me years ago. This is like 1990. Her name was Virginia Bullock. I met Jenny as a healer and a medium in Cassadaga. And after several years, she passed, and that was a little strange. I got an email from her on a Thursday that God was going to heal her heart, and she passed over Saturday morning. Wow. But Jenny told me, she says, people don't realize that they're spiritualists. She says, you're a spiritualist if you believe that Jesus was crucified on the cross, if you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, if you believe that Jesus appeared to his disciples and ate and drank with them, if you believe that Jesus talked to the two men on the Emmaus Road, if you believe that Jesus ascended into the clouds, into heaven, in the presence of 500 people, those are all spiritual activities demonstrating all kinds of things. I mean, here's Jesus in a body reappearing. We can call that an apparition. We can call that an ectoplasmic body. We can call it spiritual body. And St. Paul talks about the spiritual body in his letters. Now, St. Paul and I go round and round about some things, but that's not one of them. Okay? So, here we are back to the Bible, the New Testament, looking at spiritual behaviors. Second, spiritualism is a religion because it's based on a set of beliefs and a set of principles that people agree on. And that's what a religion's all about. And we don't have a dogma. We don't have a doctrine. We have what's called the principles of guidance. There's 9 statements, like we believe in infinite intelligence, etc., etc. It's a philosophy because it connects into all the great thoughts in the history of the world, in the way to live, and the way that life is better. It's a science because it's been tested and tested and tested. It's been tested in the laboratory. It's been tested outside the laboratory. Data has been filed. You have the SPR in England, the Society for Psychical Research. You have the American Society for Psychical Research, founded by William James. All these people are doing experiments to test what's going on. So that's 2 ways that I define it. It is a religion based on communication with what I call the next dimension. Do I talk to the dead? No. I talk to the living in the next dimension because, my friends out there, we cannot die. We are energy. Energy changes form, but we cannot die. We keep on going. And spiritualism teaches forward movement and upward progress.
And other people would call it the survival hypothesis of the continuation of our consciousness. I feel too that spiritualism, another good way to put it, is a way for us to get more in contact with our divine self, our light, our own light being.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Now, as far as this is another question I wanted our listeners to also know about Reverend Ben too, is how many languages are you able to speak fluently?
It's funny. French is my default language. Even when I can't do English, French comes out. I was in South Germany in 2003 teaching voice in a little town where they knew Disney English. They knew Fort Lauderdale, they knew Disney, and a couple other words. But my reflex when I can't think of a word is it comes out in French. Well, they didn't know any French either, so it didn't help. That got lots of laughs when I tried to speak French in Germany. It got even more laughs when I tried to speak French on St. Lucia, and they spoke Creole and I spoke Parisian French, and it's 2 different worlds. But French is my default language. Italian, I can handle myself in. I was in Italy, and if I stayed in Italy a while longer, I'd pick it up more. Yeah. Latin, especially Church Latin, I've got. Germany, I was in Germany for 2 months And by the time we left, I was reasonably fluent. German's a rather difficult language because they tend to take a lot of small words and string them together to make what the big word means. And you just have to remember, that. But my son and I, we did fairly well with that. So there's 4 or 5.
So what is it like then to do readings in another country where they're predominantly using a different language?
I got a phone call one night. I kept getting these weird phone calls. They were coming from France. And I kept thinking, who do I know in France? And it turned out to be a client that I had done readings for who lived in Maine. But he and his wife owned property in France around Lyon, and they were staying with their cousins, which were 2 women. And he kept ringing me up, and he finally got me, and he told me who he was. Oh, yeah, I know who you are. So he says, I've got my cousins here. Could you do a short reading for each one of them? Which I did in French. And whatever it was, worked. Not remembering what I said or not being sure about what I said, but still.
Yeah.
And there was a girl who came to Cassadaga one day. I remember her. And I went to her, may I give you a message? Sure. And I said, what is your name? She said, Beatrice. I said, no, tu sono Beatrice. And she looked at me, and I said, sono Italiana, see? Something psychically had said she was Italian.
Yeah.
And she said, see? I said, quale città? She said, Venezia. I said, oh, Venezia. She was from Venice. I'd been to Venice. So that whole conversation took place in Italian in front of the Grove service in Cassadaga. And my partner Rick says he just never knows what language is going to pop out of my mouth.
Yeah.
Now, if it's French, he can pick it up. Italian and German and Latin, he doesn't know. He just says, you just said something, I don't know what it was.
You were also you retired from the public school system here in Florida, Lake County?
Right. I was in the Lake County schools for 32 years.
And you taught, what course?
I taught economics for over 20 years.
Yeah.
Got awards for being the best economic teacher in Central Florida from Junior Achievement. And I added to that, of course, I'd been teaching world history. Uh-huh. And somehow, God knows how, I got sophomores to write term papers on historical subjects, doing the cards and the research and the whole thing.
Yeah.
I don't know how I pulled that off. But later, in the last few years at Groveland High School, before we became South Lake, I was assigned to teach advanced placement European history, which is a natural outgrowth of world history.
Yeah.
And so I taught that for about 15 years. The last 6 years at South Lake High School, the principal came to me. He had sent me to St. Pete to take classes in the Holocaust. And I became very good friends with the synagogues down there and the Jewish community. And I had a whole big notebook from this class, and I wrote a course in Holocaust Studies, which was a semester course. And he said, what would you like to put on the flip side of that? I said, well, I'd love to teach world religions. I said, our kids here in South Lake County, I said, they're into very fundamental Christianity. And they're taught that that's the only thing that's out there. And I said, that's not so. I'd like to prepare them to be citizens of the world. And so I wrote a world religions course. Wow. And the last 6 years, I taught Holocaust and religion and AP history. And apparently had an impact. Yeah. Because that's what the kids come back and talk about.
It would definitely be an impact today when, especially what we're seeing on the news, taking the Bible out of public schools, taking religion totally out of public schools. And you bring something, if that was in our schools today, who knows?
And with that, actually, what was that like? When did you retire, and what was the situation as far as, in your opinion, when they took the Bible out of schools?
I retired in 2006. I don't have a problem with the Bible in school as long as it's the Bible as history or the Bible as literature. But when it becomes the Bible as doctrine and dogma, see, we had something in the schools called Youth for Christ, and we had the Christian Club and that kind of thing. And I found out that what they were using for that club was material from the Baptist Church.
Yeah.
I have nothing against the Baptist Church, but I think when you choose one, that's a problem. You've got to do something that is more neutral, that is more inclusive, rather than exclusive. I know when I was in Lake County, I was told very bluntly by the Ministerial Association of South Lake County that I could not be a member because I was not a Christian. And it was, in order to join this association, you had to declare Christ as your Lord and Savior. And as a spiritualist, I don't do that.
Yeah.
And so my comeback, I said, so you are not a ministerial association, you're a Christian association. Well, do you have a problem with that? I said, well, it's exclusive. You exclude the Buddhist, you exclude the Hindus, you exclude the spiritualist, you exclude the Muslims, you exclude everybody that's not Christian. And their response, well, that's all right. If they'd be Christians, they could join. And I'm going, wait a minute, that's not the purpose. Not to my mind, that's not the purpose of this whole thing. So
Yeah.
that bothered me. That bothered me. And I didn't want to make myself a target. Didn't want to paint the target on my back, so I kind of left it alone. But I tell you, baccalaureate was another issue at South Lake High School because the county let it go because they were getting all these complaints. So it was handled by the individual ministerial associations. And baccalaureate, by definition, is an inspirational talk to seniors that are graduating. And they asked me one time to do it. And there was an uproar because he's not a Christian. Well, okay. And I let that go. That wasn't a problem. But there was one service when my daughter graduated that was a conversion service.
Tell more about this conversion service, the scope of it.
They went into this baccalaureate, and they were offered an opportunity to come forward to the altar to dedicate their life to Jesus.
Okay, so it was definitely more of a Baptist sort of...
Which is, to my mind, is inappropriate for that particular event. That should take place in individual churches, not at a high school baccalaureate service.
Yeah.
And my daughter was offended, and children of other teachers were offended. So the next morning, we called the president of the association and complained, and her response was, well, I thought it was great. Okay. But it turned out she ended up getting relieved of her duties.
Now, this is interesting, too, because when we think of integrity and we think of intentionality, and then thinking of, say, the greater good and whose greater good, for whom are we serving? And so thinking about this and actually the scope of this program, Conscious Radio, let's talk a little bit about consciousness at different levels and how folks play the game at only certain levels and how far that we can go to rise above these leveling points, so to speak.
These layers, the ladder.
I think that's one of the great things about my development classes, my mediumship classes, is we're working with consciousness, and we're working with opening the receptors, and we're working with developing those consciousness factors. And I think we need to do that. I remember at South Lake High School, when I was teaching the Buddhist unit, we had a meditation day. And all my religion classes all day long would study meditation, and they would do 2 or 3 different types of meditation. And I remember one year I got together with the psychology teacher, and we arranged to meet the meditation day in the chorus room. And the chorus teacher's a good friend. I'd known her for 30 years. We pushed all the risers back. The kids had been told, wear loose clothing, bring pillows, bring towels. By the time I got there, I had my robes on. I got there with 2 candles and my Buddha. And I put that on a little stand down front. And I sat beside it on a cushion. And we had 80 kids lined up across the room on cushions. Everybody's down on the floor. And for the next hour, we did meditations. Yeah. And the kids told me, if we could start our day that way, every day with a meditation, 30 minutes, it would make the biggest difference in learning and learning curve and behavior modification.
Yeah. So how do you think it is then that this isn't a part of our, say, students' lives through the sanctioned channels of public education?
Because I think they think it's about religion. You see, Buddhism, to me, I had a very good friend who was a Buddhist nun ordained by the Dalai Lama. She studied Vajrayana Buddhism, okay? And she convinced me that Buddhism is more of a practice, a way of life, than it is a religion, okay? Therefore, I think we could teach meditation, and I do. I go back every year to South Lake High School to Gail Dowman's classes, and I teach meditation.
Yeah.
I take one day and teach all her classes. Sometimes we do a jewel tree meditation. Sometimes we do an anatta meditation, which is loving kindness. Mm-hmm. But we do meditations all day long.
Yeah.
And the kids, I didn't get to go last year. The schedule got discombobulated, okay? And the kids, they went to Mrs. Dowman, you promised us he'd be here, and he's not here. So I'm going in 2 or 3 times this year to try to catch some of those kids. But she had kids that started with her in the 10th grade, and they would come back to her class on meditation day when I was there just to do it again. You'd have all these kids getting out of other classes to come do meditation. It was really great.
Now, let's talk about meditation a little bit, and let's go even further into, say, a practice for any given person out there as a positive experience, either to start the day, to end the day, anytime in the middle of the day. Let's talk about meditation both at the church and also in, say, mediumship classes, etc., and what's behind that for people to glean from and to develop themselves through meditation.
The idea is to make contact, to get past the ego, to get past the conscious factors of I, me, and to get beyond that, to get in contact with the next dimensions, make it plural, and to be in contact with that information. Also, meditation's good for you. It's relaxing. When I say things like leave the cares of the day behind you, I mean exactly that. Let it slide off. And just be here in the moment now, breathing. Watch your breath at the end of your nose. Do that for an hour and don't think about anything else. You know, it's just amazing what that will do for you. When we find that kids start meditating at an early age, grades go up, ability to learn goes up, the ability to grow in many, many areas of their lives, friendships, part of it, all areas of their life are going to be made better. And one of the reasons that we have so much trouble is because we don't do that, and we live in a very material culture. Mm-hmm. We don't live in a spiritual culture. Now, I haven't said religious culture here.
We live in a mind culture.
Yeah.
Go, go, go.
Yeah.
The mind, the ego, the materialistic.
And you've got to get past that. Casey said the self, meaning the ego, is the greatest enemy. Because the I, the construct that when we say I am going into the store, I am getting in the car. Who is I? Can you touch I? No, you can't. I used to tell my students in the Buddhist unit, I want you to touch yourself. and they would put fingers, and then they realized that they were touching their arm or they were touching their hand. Mm-hmm. They weren't touching themselves, because you can't.
Yeah.
The self is not a permanent thing. It's a construct. It's a gathering of aggregates.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, actually, to remove the self, actually, in psychotherapy is really great, but people have to be ready to grasp that concept.
I'll never forget the Dalai Lama at Harvard. I have all his lectures from there, and he goes one line at a time. This would drive you crazy. A line of Tibetan, a line of English, a line of Tibetan, a line of English. But he was working with the Western psychologists, and they were talking about the self. And Buddhism says there is no permanent self. And the psychologist said, well, we have to have a self before we can do away with it. Okay.
Now, let's go into the concept of self and or I, and let's talk a little bit about spirit and what some of the hang-ups might be depending on the development of that individual consciousness before that change called death to some degrees, how that comes through.
The Buddhist will say that the psychic abilities are the lower levels of consciousness. That's what you're going to develop when you start meditating and you start going into it, that there's thousands of higher levels than that. And I can accept that. I can accept that. I can see it. I can feel it. But I think that this energy, this form, or formlessness, this energy, this vibration that we call spirit, it's something that is part of us. It's who we are. It's who we really are. For example, Shirley MacLaine. Everybody thought she was wacko. Shirley MacLaine stands on the beach at Malibu, and she shouts, "I am God." We all are. Every single one of us is God. And I'm going to tell you the most heretical thing that I say to people. There is no God out there. When we pray to the infinite spirit, the infinite intelligence, we are activating energies and vibrations within ourselves. God, if God exists, which I think God does exist, I don't use the word God, the infinite spirit, but it's within us. It's not outside of us. Mm-hmm. It's an organizing force. It's what makes everything work. And it is manifest in what we call natural law, the way things work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what about for, say, those who don't get it, at least the concept of natural law and how that plays out and how that can play out, say, for folks who are already kind of in that next dimension that might need, say, some kind of rescue or a little bit of counsel?
I'll tell you this much. Natural law is there. It's immutable. Whether you believe in it or not, it's going to affect you. And so it's so much nicer if you are in harmony than if you're fighting against it all the way. If you're trying to be the square peg in the round hole, you're going to struggle. But if you have developed your consciousness to a point where you're the round peg going through the round hole, it's a whole lot easier. It's a whole lot easier. And if you can live as though the self does not exist. If you live a life of service to others, it's all about, I'll never forget Daitong telling me this, Daitong Choyan. It's all about others and serving others. And I think that's one of the things that is so wonderful about being a pastor, even of a small church. My every waking moment and some of my sleeping moments are all about the church and serving people and what can I do to make this a better experience? What can I do to help us move forward and upward?
And that also brings me toward a very clean application of mediumship in what mediums are doing if they're operating at that pure level and not at the, say, parlor trick level and showmanship level as well, right?
Oh, I've got medium friends, not meaning they're not extra large, but I have friends who are mediums who do house parties. But when we do house parties, you go in and you do messages and readings. It's a house party because you've got 20 or 30 people there, and everybody's drinking coffee and everybody's eating food and having a great time. But it's a party because people are doing, and Rick and I used to do that. We used to travel and do that. We charged $20 a piece. And everybody got a message and everybody got talked to, and then we would put a table in, and those that wanted to speak to spirit through the table, we could do that. And then we'd have some wonderful food, and it lasted 2 or 3 hours. We had a wonderful time.
And so this would be basically, allowing a family member to come through for, say, so-and-so over here who's here in this three-dimensional form body, and there's sort of a reunion of sorts, and however many...
Yes, and people get closure. I just had a phone call the other day from a lady. She said she knew me 20 years ago at Cassadaga. I thought, okay, I don't remember you, but I'm not supposed to. And apparently her father has just passed. And she said, I need some closure and I need to talk to you. That's what we do. Spiritualists, I guess you could say in a lot of ways we're death counselors, but we make that final connection because there's a lot of time that people pass over and somebody wasn't there that wanted to be, and they're feeling guilt. Of course, in the Jewish community, it's guilt is the other direction. It's why was I spared, which is a whole different ball of wax. But people come to spiritualists for a lot of different reasons. A lot of people come because they want to be in touch with those deceased relatives / friends on the other side. They want to know, because in our material culture, we're not sure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They want to know that that person in the next dimension is all right and that they're happy. They want to know who they're with and what they're doing. Okay? Now, some people come to, the biggest question I get, and I laugh about this, I have women who come to my reading room. Am I going to get a man? And I'm saying, why do you need one? You're perfectly fine on your own.
Right.
When am I going to get a man? What they want to hear is that Mr. Tall, Dark, and Handsome with blonde hair and green eyes is going to pick him up at the door tomorrow at 3 o'clock. That's what they want.
Yeah.
What I tell them is, what is the desire of your heart?
Mm-hmm.
What do you desire in a male companion? And they give me this whole list of stuff. And I say, okay, visualize it, draw it on paper, write it down, meditate on it, and work at making it happen, bringing it into vibration, into the real world, into the material world. And they look at me and said, but that's homework. I said, you got it.
It's kind of like they need to get their own house in order too, meaning the
Yes.
the self, if
Yes.
you want to refer to it as the self, or the I, or whatever all that is, in order to
Yeah.
get themselves into alignment, and that would be law of attraction also.
Yeah.
Now,
Getting-
sometimes I've had cases where a husband would pass over and the wife would miss him terribly, and he would come to her in the first 6 months and he'd say, I'm sending someone for you. And that someone would appear and they would go through the process and end up being married and be very happy. They can do that sort of thing from the other side.
Yeah.
Another thing to remember is when you go for a reading, into a reading situation, you may not hear from the spirits that you intended to hear from. The ones that want to talk to you will talk to you. I used to have a teacher next door. He passed about a year ago. Major Jeffries. He was a Green Beret.
Okay.
He would burst into my room. I want to talk to Lincoln. And I'd say, but does Lincoln want to talk to you? And he'd look at me and walk out the door. We actually had, at a seance at Cassadaga, we had Abraham and Mary come through one night. and it was just to come through and identify themselves. But I got on the phone with him when I got home, and I said, Lincoln came through tonight. You know, he's always wanted to talk to Lincoln. Huh?
Wow.
Now, for a lot of folks out there, you know, I'm sure we have some spiritualists on this evening who are listening to the show. And then, of course, we might have folks from all sorts of backgrounds. And could you talk a little bit about, say, table tippings, seances? And, of course, you already did cover a bit about how that goes, say, with a house party. But let's talk about the difference and the distinction between, say, spiritualists who are conducting themselves in the way that they do, say, at a house party, table tipping, get-together of sorts, versus the horseplay and those folks who would just be out there toying with spirit and with apparatus, you know, such as a Parker Brothers board game or something.
Yeah, you have to be very careful with that, because there's something called the law of attraction. And the Parker Brothers board game is a game. It's just that. It's lower level. What are you going to attract with that? You're going to attract lower level, undeveloped spirits. And we all know what can happen with that, especially if you study Andrea's books, which I am just wallowing in.
And let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, as far
By
as...
the way, I heard from her.
Yes.
Maria sent her to me as a friend, and Andrea texted me that she's moving into Central Florida and she wants to meet me and all that. And it's
nice.
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
exciting.
Yes, she's wonderful.
And for those listeners who we're referring to is Andrea Piran, who was on our show, actually our first show.
Right.
From the
Author of House of Darkness,
House
House
of
of Light, which The Conjuring was loosely based on, the
Yeah.
feature film from a couple years ago. And so that's Andrea Perrin.
But let me talk for a minute about tables and seances.
Absolutely.
One of my primary tools, and I got really tickled at the Seven Sisters, because I am listed as an incredible physical medium. Never quite thought of myself that way. But I started working with tables with Anita Evans, Reverend Anita Evans at Cassadaga. And I learned a lot. I worked with her, and I worked with Reverend John Lillick. John's in spirit now. And I learned how to do that. I learned how to set that up. I learned how it worked. And we used to have seances for families and groups, and we charged a good bit for it, but we figured if you go to a medium for a reading, you're going to pay anywhere from $60 to $100. If you go to a seance that takes 2 to 3 hours, we charge $70 a piece for that. Included with that was refreshments at the end and so forth. But we would start out, first of all day long. Anita had a reading room in her house. The house was specially constructed. There was a medium's closet in one side of the room, and there was a portal up in one corner of that, because there was one of the spirits, one of the servants from the house before, that used to sing, and we'd hear her when we were in that closet. But we would go in the morning, and we would set the table, and we would start incense burning, and we would start quiet music, and we would sage the room and just seal it and let it cook all day. Isn't that a funny term? Let it cook all day. And by the time it got dark, the family would be there. We would smudge everybody. We would tell them what to expect. We're going to put our hands on the table. We're going to say prayers for protection. We're going to cover everything in the white light. We're going to ask for the highest and best. Like attracts like, law of attraction. So that you don't get any of those lower level problem-causing, violent tricksters, okay? And it just became remarkable, the information that came through. I'll never forget, we had one family that had mafia ties. And the husband had been killed in Chicago by the mafia. And we started digging into that with questions. And he came through and he said, don't follow this up. They'll come after my son.
Wow.
We got instruction, and all kinds of things happened. My guide, Ome, came through, literally, he came through twice that I know of. One time he was floating over my head in flowing robes. The other time he was a shower of purple glitter right in the middle of the table. Unbelievable stuff. But after we would say prayers, and the way I feel about the Parker Brothers board, if you're going to do that, if you just must do that, which I hope you won't, then you want to sit it on a Bible. And you want to put a picture of Jesus on one side, you want white candles, and you want to cover it in white light and protection. You want to pray the Lord's Prayer over it. Then after you do all that, pick it up, throw it away. Don't burn it. That makes the spirits angry. But don't use that. Don't do that. It's lower order. And then you sit at the table and you say a prayer of protection, white light, highest and best. You say the Lord's Prayer. Every person at the table says, I dedicate my body, mind, and spirit to facilitate this seance. We put our hands on the table, spider style, and that table soon starts to rock, and it can move, it can levitate off the floor, it can tip up on one leg. We had a funny little table one night that was small. It was kind of like that one, and it had skinny little legs, and it got up on one leg and twirled like a ballerina. It was somebody's son, and he did that for almost 4 minutes.
Wow.
He was unbelievable. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has come through. Sir William James has come through. And they're big. Sir Arthur was a big man, so it's very muscular, very strong movement. And you can tell when you ask questions, and you can tell by the way the table moves if you've got a female or if you've got a male. And you can get all kinds of information. Now, seances, you can go beyond that. You can have a trumpet. And a spiritualist trumpet can literally, we had ours move down in Fort Lauderdale. It moved about a half an inch. We sit it up and draw a circle around it so we can tell if it moves. But in the old days, around the turn of the 20th century, trumpets used to fly around the room. And they would come and they'd aim at somebody, and a voice would come out.
Yeah.
And it was direct voice. Everybody could hear it.
Yeah.
And it would sound a little bit tinny, like
a gramophone.
like
Yeah.
like Jimmy Durante singing Westminster Cathedral. But, and I know at Cassadaga there was one time that one of our mediums, his father was in an accident and was killed, and the mother wanted the wedding ring and she didn't get it. And 6 or 8 months later, he was in a trumpet seance, and the trumpet came to him and Dad's voice came, and the wedding ring rolled out of the trumpet into his hands to give to his mother. So you can get apports, which are things that materialize out of the ethers for you during trumpets.
Now, what about things disappearing, or like say at people's houses, and you get a call to investigate disturbances? Let's say, what about apports in that way?
Well, apports are something that appears.
Okay.
Apport, the verb apporter in French is to carry, so they are carried through the ethers. And also, when you don't need something, it's taken back. You don't need it anymore. Bye.
That usually happens with crystals for people, or stones. They'll just disappear, and then it'll show up when it wants to, when you need it.
Exactly. And now, for the listeners out there that aren't familiar or haven't really researched the table tipping or the table tipping seance, and actually get to see some of Ben's work, they could go to the YouTube Claremont Paranormal. Go to the YouTube search engine and type in Claremont Paranormal, and there is an actual channel for Claremont Paranormal, and I believe the first 3 videos up there are all table tipping seances that Ben had and us through Claremont Paranormal had participated.
And Reverend Rick was there.
That's
And
right.
Reverend
7
Rick, yes.
Sisters Inn up in Ocala, and that's CLERMONT, Claremont.
Correct. Yep.
The 7 Sisters Inn has been so cool. I was so sorry I missed the main event, but I got sick that day, and Rick told me when he got there and everything went, he said, you didn't need to be there. I said, okay. But they announced my name and said they missed me, and I thought that was great. But 7 Sisters Inn that night We had 24 or 25 people there, and we must have had 500 spirits. I was having to elbow my way through the room.
And that was Halloween.
Yeah,
And it was a full moon also, and
This
that was
past,
2014.
This past Halloween.
That was just remarkable. That table went around that whole room. And I don't mean it went around, it went from person to person. It hit everybody. Everybody got messages. Mm-hmm. Everybody got questions answered. It was one of the most remarkable evenings because it was so crowded. And the energy was just cooking.
Yeah.
And of course, the intention that was placed there through prayer,
Right,
and
right.
with all of the attendees as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the way Rick and I set things up. I would never walk into a house and just say, everybody that's here, come on through.
That's what Andrea Perrin talks about with that spiritual, what was it, a malpractice that she
Yeah.
talked about back in 71 or whenever that was, 79 or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
You know, when I heard that on the radio, I thought, oh my stars. That medium let that go on? Oof,
Yeah.
wow.
And so please talk about that, especially about how we don't just show up at somebody's house and say, hey, come on in. You know, it's qualified, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, you want the highest and best information, and you cover it in the white light of God, and you ask for the protection of the divine source, so that you only receive that highest and best information from those that desire to communicate with you. You don't just throw wide the doors,
Right.
because all kinds of things can come through. Mm-hmm. And some of it you may not want, and you may not know how to handle.
That's right.
So have care.
Right, absolutely.
Follow the rules and be respectful. I've never forgotten a seance we did that was filmed by Polk County Paranormal, and we were accused of manipulating the table. But they brought this guy in. They didn't tell us they were going to do this. And he's on the table, and he's saying, are you the dark spirit that's been pursuing me for years? I demand answers. And we had our mouths open because he was so rude.
Yeah.
And when you treat spirit that way, they're going to treat you that way.
And it's really the same thing as how do we treat each other? I mean, really, you think about it, because they are each other. We are.
Yeah.
So if you go walking into somebody's house saying, hey, I want to brawl, and I'm a big, mean person or whatever like that, looking for it, it's kind of like walking in expecting a brawl, or also walking in the same way in a very loving presence and on that hand as well. So how do you conduct yourself? And what do people attract to themselves depending on where they're at in their own head and their intention and their vibration?
Mm-hmm.
Again, the spirits that want to talk to you, that know you need to hear from them, are the ones that are going to come through. Now, I always tell people, if you're going to go to a seance, especially one of mine, start working about 14 days before. Tell spirit over and over and over, I'm going to be at Reverend Ben's house, and give my address and my city and the time. And I want to meet you there. 9 times out of 10, they'll be there. Every year, around April 1st, I have a former student whose brother passed on April 1st. And she'll call me and she'll say, it's time to talk to Eric again.